Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Flicks the Church Forgot. This is the show where I explore the deeper and occasionally spiritual themes that you can find in horror movies. Now remember, if you're interested, you can follow me on Twitter at Rev Peter Laws, or you could subscribe to this channel, of course, the YouTube channel, or you can go to Facebook and search for the Flicks the Church Forgot to join in there. But I'm also writing a book at the moment for Icon Books, which asks why normal, everyday people, like yourself perhaps, are drawn to the spooky, macabre, and sometimes downright repellent. If you want to get involved in the research for that book, then can I encourage you to check out the video on my YouTube page, which is about that. But for now, let's turn our attention to tonight's review, which is a bumper box set of no less than 17 discs with 14 movies. It's the new Arrow Blu-ray release of the Herschell Gordon Lewis Feast. On the 26th of September, I was idly scrolling around on Twitter and the internet as you do, and I noticed that the name Herschell Gordon Lewis was suddenly starting to crop up on my news feeds. Now, if you're anything like me, who tends to be a bit of a positive thinker, I started thinking like, oh wow, finally the mainstream culture is noticing and discovering the director of 2000 Maniacs. And at one point, you're thinking, I guess Tim Burton, I bet you he's making a movie out of his life. Or who knows, Lewis himself may have announced he's directing Blood Feast 3 at last. But alas, the news ended up being really a lot sadder than that. I should have known. It was the announcement of his death. He died aged 87. And BBC News and the Telegraph newspaper and the Guardian newspaper and all the big names, in Britain at least, were reporting it, bringing the so-called godfather of Gore to an audience, many of which I think had probably never even heard of him in his life, but due to his death were suddenly aware. Suddenly that made an impact. And there's an irony here, because after making a string of nudie cutie pictures in the early 1960s, Lewis himself had already recognized this exact same principle. And that is that death has the habit of getting people's attention. And the more grisly and wet, the better when it came to Lewis. This is the man who brought splatter to the cinema. He was born in Pittsburgh in 1929, the place which is so beloved of that other horror titan, George A. Romero. And it's worth just having a bit of background about Lewis before we look at the set, because, this purveyor of amateurish gore movies was actually a very gifted and intelligent man. He went to Northwestern University to take a master's degree in journalism, and then he did a doctorate in psychology. And then in the 50s, he was a teacher of English and mass communication in Mississippi State University. So the guy wasn't like an idiot, he wasn't a degenerate. This academically talented man would end up becoming famous for bringing a new level of depravity to the motion picture screen. Now this is an ironic similarity, I think, to Wes Craven, who also has a similar trajectory. He went from being a humanities professor in New York to producing low-budget indie exploitation flicks that would end up shocking and appalling the general public, never mind the sort of intelligentsia he probably used to work with in the university. So Lewis and Craven have a similar journey, I think, both sadly no longer with us. Anyway, Lewis ends up meeting a publicist called Dave Friedman, and they make some nudie cutie films in the early 60s. And this was a form of sexploitation film where, nude shots of women were intercut into a kind of narrative fun plot. And these films were successful. But Lewis was very good at spotting what audiences may want next. And so while the rest of this sort of sex movie industry started to move in the direction of what's called a more extreme beaver stage. I didn't just make that up, by the way. Apparently that's a technical term in sex movies. They went through the beaver stage of history. Herschell Gordon Lewis realized that actually it wasn't just flesh that got audiences flocking to drive it. He got under the notion, what happens if torn flesh and mutilated bodies might even bring more box office dollars and not have people staying behind because of their prudishness about sex. And so he ended up making a stack of gore movies that really did push the screen violence to unprecedented levels. Now, Arrow Video have brought out a 17-disc box set of Blu-rays and DVDs which showcase Lewis's mission to turn the silver screen red. And the set kicks off with the still arresting Blood Feast from 1963. Here we get a swivel-eyed food caterer murdering women so that he can use their severed body parts in a ritualistic worship ritual to the Egyptian goddess Ishtar, as you do. Now, this film was actually on the list of 74 films that were deemed to be video nasties here in the UK, and therefore it was banned in my country. So if you're interested, I did a podcast exploring the video nasties craze in Britain, where I didn't just cover the video nasty stuff, but I also reviewed some of the actual films themselves. And so if you want a more in-depth look at Blood Feast, you could check out the podcast audio episode for that. But safe to say, looking at Blood Feast here, now in high definition no less, the editing is still extremely ropey, and the acting is still really laughable, it's true. And on its own, you may well have found that this would have been a drive-in movie that would have sank into obscurity. But it's Lewis's decision to ramp up the gore that has given this film its longevity and its historical significance. We see the famous scene of a woman getting her tongue torn out on screen, for example. It's just an actress spitting out strawberry jam with chunks in it, while the killer holds an animal tongue into the camera. But it was still a new level of violence for the time. We also get various shots of semi-naked bodies strewn with gore. There's an interesting extra on this set, which I thought was very telling, where one commentator said that as a kid he always used to wonder, how did our culture get from the genteel horror of the Universal movies to the blood explosions of 70s and 80s horror and action cinema? He says when he saw Blood Feast, he finally got his answer. That was the transition moment. And you totally get that from watching this set, this feeling of Lewis being responsible for knocking things up a gear. He wasn't the only one doing this, but he was very prevalent in putting bloody shots of horror into his films. It would become a calling card for his subsequent films, but also for other filmmakers as well. Following that, he made Scum of the Earth, also from 1963, which is in this set, which I guess shows that Lewis was on a pioneering role. With Blood Feast, he was said to make the first splatter film, but Scum of the Earth is thought as being the first in the roughy genre, where a girl is lured into modelling nude and ends up suffering from degrading violence. Now, what makes Scum of the Earth different, I think, to some of the previous exploitation films is that, in some of the ways, some of the older exploitation films would present these violent characters and violent situations almost like a morality lesson of what not to do. They'd balance out their voyeuristic content by having a kind of, don't do this, kids, this will be bad for you, or even in a documentary sort of format. But Scum of the Earth just basically says, here's the rough stuff. Let's not have any real reason to moralize about this. Let's just watch the rough stuff. Not that the film is particularly brutal by today's standards, but at the time, these were new waters that Herschell Gordon Lewis was treading in. Scum of the Earth isn't exactly a horror movie, which you'll find on this set. There are films on here that aren't, are more like grim, depressing dramas. But with the next movie in this set, we're back into what I would call horror movie territory, and that is 2000 Maniacs from 1964, which is a really good film. It's a backwoods horror where northern city slickers visit the rural southern town of Pleasant Valley and end up getting, basically hacked and sliced by the locals in this bizarre Civil War-fueled revenge ritual. It's actually a very nifty concept. These films are going to be seen by many as pure trash, but that academic intelligence that I mentioned earlier about with Lewis, I feel like it still comes through even in the most grotty and slapdash in terms of production value films he makes. 2000 Maniacs is one of those with a political vibe, a sort of metaphor for class warfare. You've got the rural southerners, which with little money are being pitted against the supposedly sophisticated urban middle classes from up north, and it's the southerners who are the victors. And you get this sense in various scenes. For example, in one part of the film 2000 Maniacs, a victim called Beverly, I think, she's taken to this large wooden construction in the daytime that has a huge teetering rock sitting on a plate above her head. And Lewis said that this was made out of paper mache, but it was still really heavy to get up there. But anyway, I digress. She's tied underneath this rock. And the locals start hurling little rocks to hit the bullseye. And if they do hit the bullseye, the plate is going to drop and then she'll get crushed by this rock. So they keep missing the target, though. And the mayor insists that Beverly says, "It ain't fallen yet." So she does, as she's told. She fearfully says, "It hasn't fallen yet." To which the mayor replies, "Well, pardon my grammar." He just points out, I like this little playful, but still I think fairly serious commentary on the clash of North and South, of sophistication coming up against down on the farm common sense. Incidentally, that scene with the rock is kind of creepy too. When the rock does eventually fall, and it does, the townspeople just smile and nod over and over while an oboe plays this weird little tune on the soundtrack. It's kind of creepy. Anyway, this fascination and affection and fear of the deviant South also crops up in a later movie in this set called This Stuff'll Kill You from 1971. This is a lesser-known thriller about a bizarre church congregation who like to make their own moonshine. Now, if you want a double bill of moonshine movies, then you're in luck, because there's another film on this set called Moonshine Mountain from 1964, so you could always stick them together, drink a lot of illegal whiskey and enjoy yourself that way, I suppose. But This Stuff'll Kill You, I think, is the more remarkable of those two films on this set, because it has got the weirdest church wedding I have ever seen in a film. It starts where the bride has to strip in front of the congregation, while the pastor, the jolly pastor, asks if any members of the congregation are lusting after her. And if they are, they're invited to put their hands up, and then he calls them up and they have to basically have sex with her while all the others watch. All of this in honor of the Old Testament book of Hosea, where God called the prophet Hosea to marry an unfaithful prostitute as a sort of symbol that God would stay committed to his people, even when they were running off with other people and betraying him. And it's just like, wow, this pastor takes this symbol literally and puts it into practice. And what I'm saying is this biblical reasoning behind the depravity is, again, another example, I think, of Lewis's intelligence being in amongst the pure exploitative titillation and queasy sort of scenes. Now, there's not a lot of violence in This Stuff'll Kill You, but there is a scene near the end involving a head and a shotgun, which kind of reminds you that, oh yeah, this is a Herschell Gordon Lewis movie. And I do think that this degenerate redneck idea may well have been an influence on movies like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre just a few years later. But what's especially interesting is today. I'm recording this on November the 9th, 2016, and Donald Trump has just been voted in to be president-elect of the United States this very morning, in Britain at least. What I'm seeing on my social media feeds today is the so-called sophisticated, educated middle classes, and they are panicking at what they are labeling as the illiterate, non-book reading rednecks taking over the country. It seems to me like the sociological fears dynamics of 2000 Maniacs are as relevant today as ever, and that clash still continues, so it's a very relevant film, oddly enough.